Very quickly, who am I? I have co-authored a couple of books. I've contributed content and code to actually several other books, some of which even recognize me. That was nice. I am a frequent event speaker. I've been to JFocus a few times now and love JFocus, so I'm happy to see you here. Hopefully they'll let us all come back, right? I am an architect and developer, and as you might guess from the next bullet point where most of my expertise has been won, I am a Java champion recognized by my peers for ongoing contributions to the greater Java community. Interestingly, I have a talk later today. I'm going to be doing Java and Kotlin, so it's not a monogamous relationship, but certainly I'm, again, a big fan as well. So what are the takeaways for today? What do we hope to accomplish? Well, first, to provide at least a basic contextual understanding of outside-in security. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because, again, you could do like several whole talks based on the whole of system-wide security. But we will at least establish the context before we drill in. And again, system versus application security. Authentication and authorization, or as I like to say, who's who in the zoo. So who does what to whom, when, and how. I'm going to address that a little bit and then dive in and show it in the code and show kind of the practical aspects. I always feel like that's the best way to internalize something is when you see it in action, right? OpenID Connect and OAuth 2, what they do, what's the value, why are we here, what are we talking about? These are very important topics as well in the security realm. And rather than just talk about them, again, we'll code them. And then again, show me the code, because that's where I think you can talk about things, you can see things, but when you really see them in action, that's where, at least for me, that's where the understanding grows. So first, outside-in security, sort of. And I say sort of because this is a very kind of an old-school diagram. Interestingly, it's still out there being propagated by CISSP. And in the old days, this was very much the case, right? When you had a physical installation and you had a physical data center and you had physical servers and physical racks, you would worry about and you would have in kind of this enveloping order, you'd have policies, procedures, and awareness, which enveloped your physical security profile. And that enveloped your network stack, which fully enclosed your server stack, which also enclosed your application stack, which then wrapped your data. That's a great picture. Not necessarily reflective of our world in the cloud, right? Some of these have been shuffled. Some of them have been inverted. Some of them, if not entirely gone away, certainly have dramatically changed. Because many times we'll be hosting our database and providing that via, basically via a URL from one service, and then we'll have our application stack somewhere else, which is deployed into containers which are basically created on images that somebody else provides and locks down security-wise. So, I mean, this whole thing is shuffled quite dramatically, but the concept is still pretty good as long as you're not hard and fast on the order and the nesting, if you will. So the general principles do still apply and are still valuable to think about and talk about, but you have to refocus a little bit for this century, because after all, it is 2019. A few thoughts on system security, and again, we could do whole talks, whole days on system-wide security, but just a really quick touch before we drill down quickly and much further. You should have good password and access hygiene, and by that, just certainly not limited to, but these are kind of the high points. Two-factor authentication, the more factors, obviously, the better better off you are. Sane authorizations, typically you've always heard security folks talk about the principle of least, just went blank, principle of least permissions, right? And that basically means that you should only have the authorities to do exactly what you need to do and no more. The problem is, of course, it's overly restrictive, and that impacts your time to market. That impacts your deployability, deployment schedule. So that's why I say sane authorizations, because you need to obviously have the ability to get a lot of things done. It's very frustrating to have a 5-minute change that you need to make and take 5 weeks to get approval for deployment, right? So sane authorizations are, I think, very important. You should have the ability to get things done without opening the barn doors and letting all the animals out. So you should also have logging and auditing so that you can see what's going on in real time or near real time and respond to that very quickly and lock down threats that are happening or address issues that you find that surface. Wire encryption, very important. You hear things like transport layer security, TLS, HTTPS, right? If you're accessing any website still, even just a plain old website, and you're not using HTTPS for it, Probably not a good idea in 2019, right? So wire encryption is very important. In the old days, this added some overhead and delays. Not so anymore, right? Things have gotten much, much better. So there's really not an excuse for that, and it keeps your channel encrypted, right? Your communication channel. You should store secrets securely. So if you need to access something, you probably shouldn't put your critical secrets that you need to have to access that in the header of your HTML, right? That's probably not a good idea. So you need some way of storing and retrieving those securely. Things like HashiCorp Vault come to mind. It's a very easy and readily available way to store those that is much more secure, obviously, than many other mechanisms you might have access to. And we've talked about kind of just briefly data over the wire, right? Why that's important that should be encrypted, but it also should be encrypted at rest. It does no good if somebody manages to compromise your network and you have your database sitting there and you haven't encrypted anything, right? Because if they can get at that and do a dump, guess what? They have the keys to the kingdom. So data at rest needs to be encrypted as well. Again, could go into a lot more detail about all this and would happily do it at another time. But for today, let's focus in and drill down deeply into application security. Focusing primarily on Spring Security. Fully open source library can be used with Spring framework applications, Spring Boot applications, non-Spring applications. So I mean, you can use it in pretty much any context. Again, it's fully open source. It's out on the web, out on GitHub. Pull it down, take a look, check it out. It's a great framework. It's well established. And again, it's out there for use. It is a little bit complex, as most security frameworks and security components and libraries are, right? I mean, it can't be terribly simple because it's got to address a number of threats and attack vectors. But what I like to do is think of it at a very high level and drill into it, because I think at a very high level, it's not really that complex. And it's easy to kind of start there and then drill in. There are three kind of high points that I like to point to. One is the HTTP firewall. So that's a newer feature in Spring Security 5.x, right? And what that does is check for and block malformed URIs, right? So if you have something that's coming in, it's very that's a particular attack vector that is easy to exploit in many cases. But if you can filter out some of those garbage, malformed URIs, then that reduces your attack profile, your surface profile, quite dramatically. So that's kind of nice to have just up front, right? It's by default set to the strictest setting. Now, you'll see this consistently throughout. Spring is what they call an opinionated framework, just in general, all the various components, which means that, generally speaking, you can get up and running very quickly with a minimal amount of configuration. You can get right to your business problem at hand. But that doesn't mean we want to lock you out from not tweaking. If you need to tweak, by all means, there's the ability to do that. However, we want to start from a position of security. This isn't Mongo. We don't want to throw open the doors. We want this to be secure by default, and then if you need to back it off, you can. By the way, if anybody here working for Mongo, I'm sorry. That was. I like to point at that because, frankly, we like things to be easy to use and open, and then when somebody makes it easy to use and open, we don't bother configuring it, and then we gripe because it's insecure. But so that's not really on them terribly entirely. But Spring Security, secure by default, and you'll see that as we go through quite often. The security filter chain, this is kind of central to everything. I think this is the kind of the magic sauce, right? Because what you can do is set up different pattern matching capabilities within, and you have this chain of filters. And what happens when a request comes in, obviously once it clears the HTTP firewall, and it's valid request coming in, what happens is it'll go through and it'll check each of your filters that you establish. And as soon as it hits a match, then it goes ahead and continues, right? It services that request. What happens if it doesn't make a match? Nothing happens, right? You don't get through. So this allows you to route, to set up authorization as you see fit. Very flexible, very configurable. We'll get into that a little bit more in a moment because I think that's a very valid point to understand. And then request headers. The Internet Engineering Task Force sets up certain request header configurations, different parameters that you can set, which largely go to circumvent or to eliminate, block any potential attack vectors in certain cases, things like clickjacking and I'm trying to think, I'll have to look at some of these just to remind myself. Cross-site scripting protection and having browsers or other user agents that'll sniff the content and think of, hey, this looks like a JPEG, let me just render it for you. The problem with that is you can embed scripts in graphic files and things like that. So what looks like a JPEG or a PNG file, the browser will render, and then guess what? The JavaScript that's embedded will run. If your user agent will sniff that and say, hey, I've got this, I can interpret this. So you definitely want to lock down those very easy to lock down attack vectors as well. Most or all of those headers are provided out of the box by default by Spring Security. Again, you can tweak it, fully configurable. But there are very few cases I can think of where you'd want to allow clickjacking. So anyway, we'll just leave it at that. That's, again, a very important part, I feel like, of the overall 3,000-meter view. There is more, of course. I'm simplifying this and streamlining it, but I think these are the high points to focus on. Getting into a little bit more of the request filtering. And again, even this is simplified, but basically what happens is we create a filter chain proxy with a delegating filter proxy. And that filter chain proxy, again, comprises a chain of filters. Kind of makes sense, right? Filter chain proxy. And typically, or what can happen, you can have multiple security filter chains that form this filter chain proxy. What typically happens is you have one, because most of the time you don't necessarily need multiple security filter chains, but you can. The possibility is there should the need arise. But what typically happens, you have a security filter chain that you define in your application, and then again, it just navigates down through and checks to see what matches, and nothing matches, nothing happens. But if it hits a match, then it goes ahead and processes that request per your instructions, right? Again, the concept is very, very simple. So let's dive in a little bit more and see this in action. And this is what I like to call the application security tire fire. Hopefully, we won't run into that. But so let's get started. Oh, good. We've got good time, which means I'm only going to be crazily rushed to get through this. Yeah, so that's good. All right, so does everyone recognize this site? This is the Spring Initializer. This is your starting point for Spring Boot-based microservices on the web. Again, you don't have to go here to get started, but it's a very easy way to on-ramp and start creating your Spring Boot applications. Again, you don't have to use Spring Security with Spring Boot, but you're going to see this a lot, and it takes care of a lot of the behind-the-scenes plumbing for you, right? It simplifies your dependency management. You have auto-configuration. We're going to be talking about that a little as I go. I narrate extensively as I code. So that allows you to focus on the problem domain, because Spring Boot will say, hey, look, you've got these dependencies included in your project. You've written this code. You have these properties set. I know you want to do this. 99% certain you want to do this, so let me spin up these beans that will support your use case. And 99% of the time, that's perfect. If you need to tweak it, again, you can, but that saves you a lot of the manual plumbing and configurations. You can focus on the security, which is awesome. So I'm going to start off. I want to cover a couple of things here today in the code. The first is the more simple example, which is your username password authentication, right? And I kind of mentioned earlier the authentication and authorization. I'm already getting dry. You can tell I'm talking a lot. So what's the difference? Well, authentication is you proving you're you, right? Yes, what's your name? Old? Og?
Opposite of even. Old.
Oh my gosh, okay, perfect. Yeah, sorry. So Od. Okay, so are you you? Can you prove you're you? That's authentication. So you have some mechanism. The simplest way is something you're probably very well accustomed to based on numerous apps, numerous sites, and that's username and password. You type in your username, you type in your password. If you match, yay, you win. You're granted access to the system. Then you have authorization. What are you allowed to see? What are you authorized to see and access and do with the system, with the application? And those are two distinct things. Oh my. Well, that's awkward. Systems, preferences, screensaver. Oh, 2 minutes. That will not do. Okay, so let's close that. All right, so let's get started. What I'm going to start off with is that forms-based authentication, that username and password. I'm going to create a Maven project. Obviously, you can use Maven or Gradle. You can use Java, Kotlin, or Groovy. I'm going to stick right down the middle right here today with Maven project using Java. Current version of Spring Boot, so we get all the current bits. I'm actually just going to change this to the Hecklers because that whole example.com thing, so bland. So I'm going to create a service called ssec for Spring Security, forms. We'll do that. And I'm going to bring in a few dependencies, just a couple. This is our web dependency, which gets us Tomcat and Spring MVC. That's your typical imperative application. There is a reactive component within Spring Security as well. I'm just going to focus on the standard imperative stuff because that's, let's face it, that's the bulk of our workload still, and will be for the foreseeable future, sadly. But it is what it is. And then I'm going to bring in the security dependency, Spring Security. And we'll just generate the project. And there we go. I'm just going to save that to the desktop. And there we go. And I'm going to unzip that and open that in my favorite IDE, NetBeans. Just kidding. NetBeans is an awesome IDE, but I find IntelliJ actually fits my workflow really well, so we'll go with that. But anything's fine. It all works. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go to my POM. Come on, IntelliJ. Oh, gosh, I need to change this. I'm so sorry. I've still got the appearance. Let's change this to high contrast. I find that really pops. Whoa, my eyes. Okay, so, oh, that's much better. Okay, so again, we just have our couple dependencies. That's pretty straightforward. Let's go to, actually, I don't even need to mess with the properties. Let's just go to our main application class, and let's start coding. Can everyone see that? Yes? Okay, good. So I'm just going to start off really quickly by providing something to secure, right? So I'm going to create a REST controller, which will get us an endpoint, or a couple endpoints that we can access. So we'll call this class form controller. Let's do that, form controller. By the way, I type fast, which means I typo fast. So if I do have a typo and you catch it, stop me before I hit build, please. So I'm just going to create a get mapping. Actually, yeah, let's do that. And we'll just do the slash, and we'll return a string. See what I mean about typos? String. Let's see, get. We'll just do hello, right? That'll work. Oh, let's do for everyone. So everyone. So we're going to return something that everyone should be able to see, right? So return. This is for everyone. Yes, I'm terribly clever with my examples. Maybe not. Okay, so with any application, we probably should have something where admins can get in and see what's going on, right? So that would be somewhat useful. I'm going to create an admin page in that vein. So we'll just call this slash admin string admin page, right? So let's do that. Return. So let's just let's see. Let's do a header one administrators page slash h1. Come on, there we go. And then we'll just paragraph greetings admin. Yes, it's good to be noticed, right? Okay, so that's good. So that gets us a couple endpoints that we can hit right off the bat. So how do we secure this? I guess before I do that, let me go ahead and run this so we can just see what we have so far. And of course we're up and running, and I'll go to terminal. Oh, that's truly terrible. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to use HTTPy. It's like curl for humans, which I actually like. So if we go here, we can see a few things. One, we can see that the filters are in place, our header filters. So that's kind of nice. Just by default, we're blocking, we're doing the no sniff, so our user agent / browser can't sniff the content and say, hey, I think I've got this, and then pop up and run scripts. We've got the X-frame options to deny, which means our clickjacking is locked down, and then cross-site scripting protection. And this is a very blunt instrument at this point, right? If you're using a content delivery network, you may need to tweak that and whatnot, but this just, again, most secure possible by default without any exceptions out of the box. So we see that we're unauthorized, which is exactly what should happen, right? We've got in our dependencies Spring Security, so by default, things are locked down. We can't just access everything. But what happens? I mean, what just out of the gate, how do we get started with this? Well, we see that it's, by default, providing a generated security password. So that if we go back here and we do an HTTPy and we do a --auth user, and I guess I should have done this and copied this. So let's just copy this. So right out of the gate, :8080. We see it's working. This is for everyone. We also see, however, that we can get to the admin page, which this isn't terribly pretty. I'll actually pop it up in a web browser and it'll look a little nicer. But we've got to start, right? This is a little cumbersome though, because we don't want to tell all our users to use one user account. Everybody's user, that's great for auditability, right? And we also don't want to have to, every time we restart our application, get a new password and turn around and tell our 500 users that here's the password, here's the password. So we need to do a little bit better than this. But it's again, a good start for doing basically no work. No work's good. So what we're going to do is just enable some security. So we're going to @enable web security. This is an annotation that kind of kicks off the global security configuration within Spring Security. And I'm going to create a security config class, and I'm going to extend the web security configure adapter. Just rolls off the tongue, right? But this is our basic configuration, security configuration that we can get started with and run, again, very quickly and easily in Spring. Now, this allows us to do a couple of things. I'm going to actually start by overriding a configure method, which gets us our authentication, our authorization. So this we'll come back to this in a moment, but this is where we configure our authorization. But we also need to do our authentication. Now, typically in a corporate setting, in an organization, you may have your security, your authentication information, your user IDs and passwords, what have you, your hashes, stored in a database, so something like Spring Data JDBC underneath this. Or maybe you're using an LDAP provider or something else entirely. That's perfectly fine. For the purposes of the demo, I'm going to go absolutely straightest and easiest path, which is an in-memory authentication mechanism, but it works the same, right? It's just the various branch of the same tree. So I'm going to create a bean, and I'm going to provide a user details service. And let's see, let's start, we'll just call this authentication. Come on, there we go. And I need to create a couple of users. So let's start off with user details, and we'll do me first. So user.builder, and let's see, username, Mark, password. Well, I'm going to make this a super strong password here. So strong password. Shh, don't tell anyone. This isn't recorded or anything, right? Okay, I'm going to give myself a couple of roles, user and admin, and oops, there we go. And then I'm just going to build that. So that's one user account, right? So let's do another one. So user details, oops, details. Let's see, what's your name, sir? Peter. Peter. Is it just P-E-T-E-R? Okay, so Peter, right? Okay, user.builder, okay. Username, we'll go really clever on this too, Peter. And password, we'll just assign this password. Because that's what, nobody does that, right? Okay, probably more than we care to admit. And of course, since Peter doesn't have great password hygiene, we're going to just give him the user access, not admin, because that would be totally irresponsible. And then we're going to build that. So now we have a couple of users, just, again, very simple. So let's go ahead and return a new in-memory user details manager. We'll supply our couple of let's see, I'm used to using Rob Winch, who's our head of Spring Security, but he doesn't get in here today. So, okay. So we have our accounts in there. So we've got our authentication covered. Now we need to do some authorization, right? So that should allow us access. And if I ran through the example, which I'm hesitant to do because, again, our time is rather short, but if we ran through this, both Peter and I would have full access to both endpoints. Not great, right? It's good that we had access, but we need to lock that down because, again, until Peter comes up to speed on his password hygiene, this could be bad. So what we want to do is lock that down a little bit, provide the authorizations. So again, I'm going to start off and we'll configure our HTTP security here. So let's see, I'm going to do an authorize request, and I'm going to use an MVC matcher. We're using Spring MVC, so MVC matcher it is. We also have ANT matchers and what have you. But this actually tailors and dovetails very nicely with Spring MVC. So I'm going to, and I should start with, always secure the most specific stuff first. Because as soon as it hits that first matching filter, it pops out. So if you just say, hey, everybody should be able to access some stuff, but you put that at the top, everybody's going to be able to access everything, not the goal, right? So we're going to start off and say, hey, for our admin page, we want to have somebody, with the role of admin. Kind of makes sense. And we're going to authorize requests, any request, authenticated. So if it's not the admin stuff, and I guess I actually should just for good practice, anything that's in the admin endpoint or below. So we could have subpages and what have you. It has to be an admin. The person who accesses these has to have the admin role. So anything else, if they're authenticated, that's perfectly fine. I'm also going to add in form login. Now, Spring Security, by default, will create a login form and a logout form or logout page for you if you don't provide one. You can provide one, but you don't have to. It's very important that you have some way of actually getting in, though, right? So if you don't supply that yourself, a very basic generic one is provided for you, which I'll show you in a moment. We also need to, or should, cover HTTP basic for user agents that are non-browsers. So that also gives us a way to do like the --auth that I showed you by default. So let's go ahead and run this, and we'll take a quick look. Okay, we're up and running. Actually, I'll go ahead and pop open a browser here. So localhost 8080. Look at that. So it redirected for me to my login page. That's wonderful. So I'm going to log in as Peter. Shh, password, everyone. Remember that? Oh, what did I do wrong here? So Peter, always good. Nothing ever goes wrong in demos. Password. Look at that. So obviously I've got something off. So I've got a stack trace. That's good. The good thing is that in a large room like this, we can do mob programming. This is awesome. So what? Oh, I know what the problem is, because in my haste to run through this, let me open this up. One thing that I did is, you notice I've got my password sitting here. That looks an awful lot like plain text, right? That's only because it is. So let's actually show this, because I think this is instructive. Mark's password. And mark.getPassword, and we'll just bring in Peter's here so we can see what we have. I blithely skipped over this. Let's go ahead and restart this. And on the restart, let's see. Yeah, here we go. Mark's password. Now I've got my nice strong password here, and Peter's poor password is just password. But we can see this is plain text. This is not good for a couple reasons. One, it's plain text. And two, we're storing this, and when we go and try to match that, what it's going to do is try to apply a password encoder to it. So if I go back here, and Peter password, then what happens is you see this kind of ugly message, which is actually very informative, which says something along the lines of, hey, your encoder, let's see, skip past it. There is no password encoder mapped for the ID null. That's your key that you've forgotten to include or skipped over intentionally, your password encoder. We need to encode or encrypt our passwords. So I'm going to specify a password encoder, we'll just call this password encoder, cleverly enough, and we'll do a password encoder factories.create delegating password encoder. Now this is very important. I like to go and take a look at this, because this shows you a little bit of the capabilities, the forward future-proofing of password encoders within Spring Security. So right off the bat, you can see that we have a default, which is bcrypt, which is a solid default, right? But we also support, currently, out of the box, older hashes, which really not recommended, but inexplicably they're still being used in places, so we still need to support those. We also have a no-op password encoder, which is exactly what it sounds like. It actually just stores things as plain text. Also not a great idea, but it is there for demos and what have you. I just don't like to use it. We have PBKDF2, a good recommendation, scrypt, good recommendation. But what you can see here is we default to bcrypt, so we come down here and we create our delegating password encoder using bcrypt for our default and our list of encoders that we support. What this allows us to do is, over time, when new hashes, new encryption algorithms come on, we can add them in. And it's non-disruptive, right? You can even migrate a user's passwords just by them logging in. So that's also kind of nice. And it's, again, non-disruptive. But we're going to go back right now and just go to our password encoder here. And what I need to do, of course, is when we store our password, just do our encoder.encode. And we'll encode my password, and then we'll encode Peter's password here. So password encoder.encode. Oops. Typo fast. There we go. So let's go ahead and restart that, and then we should have a little bit better result. Okay, so refresh, Peter, password typing counts. And look at that. This is for everyone. So let's go up here now and see if Peter can get to the admin page. Let's hope not. Look at that. See, we've got a 403, forbidden. Not a lot of information. We don't want to provide a lot of information for free, right? We just want to say, hey, you don't have access to this. And again, remember, I said that unless you provide one, unless you specify one, Spring will provide your logout page as well, which is good, generally a good thing. So let's go ahead and log in as me, strong, password. And this is for everyone. Now, can I get to the admin page? And of course, yes, I can. So that's a very, very quick, but hopefully pretty thorough introduction to form-based authentication, your username, password authentication. So let's go ahead and take it from there, because that's a pretty good start. That covers a lot of ground. Certain companies, it covers pretty much the whole, the whole panoply, and others not so much, right? I think it's very important at this point to cover the OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. Now, who here is familiar with OAuth 2, the term at least? Okay, so OAuth 2 was created several years ago. I love this example. Our friends at Okta. Anybody familiar with Okta? It's a great organization. They provide free developer accounts. It provides our OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect capabilities, as well as, Spring Security by default, out of the box, accommodates Google logins, GitHub logins, Okta, and Facebook. I wouldn't personally recommend you use Facebook logins, but it is in there. Apparently people do like it from time to time, so your mileage may vary. But let's see, where was I with the Okta thing? Don't remember. Anyway, oh yes, the example that they use is several years ago, before OAuth 2 came into being, how did you share information? How did you share permissions and authorizations? Well, the answer was very badly, right? The example they use is when Yelp first got off the ground, and they said, hey, you're on Yelp. Your friends probably are on Yelp. Would you like to share your recommendations and your reviews of different restaurants and places? And you'd say, well, yeah, that's kind of cool. I want to see where my friends are eating so I can know if they find a new taco joint that's really good. I want to go. So how Yelp did this, and this is not bashing Yelp, this is the state of the art at the time, is they say, hey, what's your email service provider? Yahoo, Google, whatever. Oh, it's Gmail. Okay, what's your Gmail account? Here it is, mark.heckler@gmail.com. What's your password? And we'll connect to it, and we'll download your contacts, and then we'll connect you to them. And we promise not to abuse that. We'll just get rid of it once we do that initial harvest. And again, we're not busting on Yelp. That was when there's nothing, literally nothing in place to allow that kind of thing. You do some terrible, terrible things. Well, of course, this happened kind of industry-wide. So OAuth 1 came into being to try to address that. OAuth 1 wasn't that good. So very quickly thereafter, OAuth 2 came out, and OAuth 2 handled authorization really well. The problem was it only handled authorization, or at least was really designed to handle authorization. It didn't really cover the whole authentication thing. So what you had is numerous variations on a theme. A lot of different people created their own, kind of roll their own way of authenticating using OAuth. At some point, people realized this was probably not a great thing either, because it led to a lot of non-standard type of extensions. So OpenID Connect was built to address that. It's a specification that's kind of a shim. It kind of wraps or extends the OAuth 2 specification a little bit, and it's standard. So that's very nice. So the OpenID Connect handles your authentication. Your OAuth 2 definitely handles your authorization. So with that, typically what you see is you log in, you do this authentication dance. So you will connect to a provider, validate that you are who you are, and say, well, okay, I want this particular scope, and then the OAuth 2 part basically kicks in to handle your scopes, your authorizations, your authorities. So what I like to do is show an OpenID login service, and then a resource server, which is the thing that actually provides the data that you're wanting to get to. Typically, you'll have one or more of these that you're accessing data from, that is only, you're kind of gatekeeping through your login. And then from there, based on your authorities, you're granted access to different resources from different resource servers. So I'm going to start off and just create our login service. And we've got web, security, that's fine. I'm also going to bring in the reactive web dependency. The only reason I'm doing that is because that gets us our web client. Now with Spring Framework 5 on up, before that, REST template was kind of the preferred mechanism, right, for interacting with endpoints. But REST template is blocking. Web client is not. So you can use it with reactive endpoints and get publishers back, or you can just add a .block operation and you can get back your individual object type via JSON, of course. So that's kind of nice. It's very versatile. So it's also a part of the reactive web packaging, so I'm going to bring that in. And we'll use that eventually. I'm not going to use that right off the start, but we'll get to it. So I'm going to unzip that. Come on. And we'll open that up. Oh, yeah, this is the fun thing when you go into presentation mode with IntelliJ. A little quirky. So let's start off with our POM. And what I typically do is I type in my additional dependencies because we have a few dependencies that we need to add that aren't in the Spring Initializer just natively yet. They're coming. But I'm kind of showing the newest, latest, greatest stuff. That's where the fun stuff is. So I'm going to just short circuit this a little bit in the interest of time. I'm going to bring in a few more dependencies. One is the Spring Security config, which allows us to do Java configuration for our Spring Security stuff within our application. You notice one is the OAuth 2 client, which provides us with the capabilities of creating an OAuth 2 client, right? OAuth 2 Jose, which is the JavaScript object signing and encryption, which gets us our JavaScript web keys, JavaScript web tokens. By the way, JavaScript web tokens, JOTs, JWT, pronounced JOT. I know, I didn't, they never asked me these things either. I would have probably come up with something really more accurate, but terrible to pronounce, like JWIT or something, right? But JOT is just what it's called. So this gets you access to JOTs and JKS and JKs and all that. Yeah, I know. Hopefully you didn't come here for the jokes, right? And then the Okta Spring Boot Starter, which allows us to use Okta for our OpenID Connect and our OAuth 2. I'm also going to use Google for some of this as well, but that gets us kind of our start. Okta provides a nice little library. The next thing I'm going to do is go to my application.properties. And in Spring Boot applications, this is where you provide your basic sensible default properties. What I'm going to do, though, and you can provide these in the key value pairs, right, in the application.properties. But what I like to do is change this to an application.yaml, because it will read YAML equally nicely. And that way I don't have to repeat myself. Like I said, I hope you didn't come for the jokes. So this is a live template. I'm just going to paste this in because this isn't code. And nobody came to watch me type in YAML, I hope, also. But these are some properties that we need to specify. So this is the client ID and secret for Google, client ID and secret for Okta, your provider issuer ID for Okta so that we can get to our JOTs. By the way, this isn't terribly impressive. So if anybody thinks, oh my gosh, you put his client secret out there. Sure, as long as you redirect to a localhost 8080 app, you've got it. So this is fine. So let's go here and we'll go to our application, main application. And again, let's start off with creating something to access. So I'm going to create a REST controller class login controller, TR, yeah, spelling is hard. We'll do a get mapping and we'll return a string. Let's just say hello, right? Return hello JFocus. 3 exclamation points, extra credibility on Reddit. Okay, so we've got that. And that at least lets us know if we can access stuff, right? If we can log in, this will allow us to test our authentication. Really not much else, but that gets us started. Oh, I forgot to close out my other application. I'm running on the same port. No, see, it isn't so. We have 10 minutes. Oh, bother. Okay, so we're going to ride like the wind, bullseye. So we're up and running now. Let's go ahead and open this up. Localhost 8080. Look at that. Now, since I've specified we have 2 options, I'm going to go ahead really quickly and log in using Google, even though it's not my preference, but I think it's also kind of interesting to see. So I'm logging in here. And notice what comes up next. If you've specified 2-factor authentication for your Google account, you get that for free in your app as well. So guess what? I have a YubiKey here. I'm just going to plug that in. And I'm going to press on the little button. And look at that. Okay, so no extra charge, fully supported, 2-factor authentication using whatever mechanism. So that's definitely a plus, right? Hello, JFocus. All right, so now if I go up here and I just go to my log out again, Oh, whoops. Ha ha ha. Localhost 8080/log out. Sure, sure. Okay, so now let's use our Okta, right? And let's go in here. I don't have 2FA on this yet, but that's okay. We'll go ahead and log in. Boom. Okay, so that's a couple ways you can get there, but this is just our login, right? This is our authentication. We haven't done anything in authorization yet. This is where we typically will have a resource server or servers that will provide valuable content. So I'm going to go ahead and create one of those. Let me close that out. And we're going to create our resource server, service, that's fine. And I don't need to bring in my web client here because I'm just using that to get from one to the other. And this is our resource service itself behind the scenes. So let's go here and we will open that up. Come on. Okay. So once again, we go to our POM, and I'm just going to add in my security resource server dependencies, clean that up a little bit. Largely the same as we use for a login controller, except instead of an OAuth2 client, we need to provide the dependency for our OAuth2 resource server. So this gets us, again, a lot of things right out of the box by default. Very nice. So let's go to our application.properties. Once again, we're going to rename that to application.yaml. And then we'll go in here and we'll do, oops, no, there we go. Yes, there, security resource, there we go. And we'll paste that in. Pretty simple stuff. I just assign a different port so we don't have a port conflict again. And then we need to point to our JOT issuer URI so we can grab the JOTs from that for our resource server. So we're not having to continually re-authenticate rather. We're exchanging our authentication credentials for a JOT, a JavaScript web token, a bearer token, if you will. And then we're using that. Much more clean, efficient, and it's an encrypted token, right? So that's a good thing. So I'm going to go here, and then once again, I'm going to start off with creating some resources to access, because this is our resource controller, resource server. So I'm going to define a default mapping here for resources, class, resource controller. So let's see, get mapping. Let's see, let's just start off with, what happened there? There we go. So let's start off with, well, let's just start off here. So let's do get mapping here and string get something. Clever, right? So return, this is something. Yes, quality endpoints. Okay, so we're going to, also, wouldn't it be nice to be able to see the claims that our particular user has? So when somebody logs in, what access do they have? What claims do they have? What scopes do they have in OAuth2 parlance? So I'm going to just check our claims here, be able to return that. So I'm going to return that as a string, get claims, and we're going to grab our authentication principal here, our JOT again, and let's use that to return jot.get claims. And we'll just do a dot, oh no, get claims. There we go, .toString. And then it would be also nice to see who our currently logged in user is. That's very easy. That's what they call subscriber. So let's just grab the email, right? String get email. And once again, we're going to use our authentication principal. We're going to inject that, our jot. No, say it isn't so. Return jot.get claims as string. Again, this is our subscriber, and that's pretty simple, right? So now we need to provide our authorization so we can kind of limit who can get to what. Obviously, we want to button things down just a little bit. So let's create, let's do our enable web security, class security config. We're going to extend, once again, our web security configure adapter, and then we're going to override our configure so we can do our authorizations, right? So let's see, so HTTP dot, so let's see, we need to authorize requests, MVC matchers once again. So we're going to start off with claims, right? Well, actually, claims dot dot, just to star just to be complete. And we're going to ask and ensure that they have the authority. This is, again, OAuth 2 parlance. They have the authority, which is a scope, of OpenID. We're just going to make sure that they're actually authenticatable. Is that a good word? And then we're going to do another one. We're going to authorize request MVC matchers for /email /*. Once again, has authority, scope. We'll just use the email scope here to make sure that they have access to that. And we need to indicate OAuth 2 resource server JOTS. So we have JOT support. So let's go ahead and restart that. And again, that's pretty simple when you walk through it, right? It makes sense. It's logical. It's not anything really weird and off the wall. We'll get to that momentarily. But that gets you our resource server capabilities. So let's go back here to that's our forms. Okay, so let's go back here to our login service. And now we need to be able to access our resource server from our login service. So I'm going to go ahead and ramp that up really quickly. I'm going to create a web client bean. Let's see, web client. And we need to do a couple things here. I need to add a filter function. And this enables our OAuth 2 client, if you will, to access, or our web client to use our OAuth 2 authentication. So I'm going to create a filter function here, equals new servlet. I did server, didn't I? Yeah, that's our reactive one. I actually don't want that. I want the non-reactive one. Servlet OAuth 2. There we go. That's much better. Servlet OAuth 2 authentication, or client exchange filter function. Now this accepts a couple of parameters, right? A client registration repository and an OAuth 2 authorized client repository, which stores a little bit of your authenticated principal information locally. So I'm going to, the good thing is, again, that Spring Security will provide those by default, assuming that you specify that you want these injected, so you'll get those at no extra charge here with no additional configuration, just by specifying that you want this passed into this web client creation as we create the bean. So now we need to authorize client repository. We'll call this client repo, right? That's pretty simple. And then we can go ahead here and use that to create our servlet OAuth 2 authorized client exchange filter. Just rolls off the tongue. So we've got reg repo and our client repo, thank you. And that's pretty good. We also then need to take our filter function and set our default OAuth 2 authorized client. I'm going to set this to true. What this means is that the currently authenticated principal, the currently logged in user, you're going to use that principal, to access their resources. You may not necessarily want to do this. In most cases, it kind of makes sense. I'm logged in as me. I want to get to my resources. But there may be instances where you don't, and that's why you have to set this and specify this if you want to do so. But let's create our web client using this. So web client.builder.base URL. We're going to start off by accessing our resource server by default, local host 8080/resources. And we'll start there, and then we'll apply our filter function, OAuth 2 configuration, and build. So that gets us our web client. Let's go ahead down here and quickly inject this. So our web client, use constructor injection. Let's create a couple endpoints, map them to the back. Bob's your uncle. We'll make sure everything works, and then we'll wrap up. So if we want to access something, so we'll return a string, get something, and again, we're going to access our something on the resource server. So return web client.get. It's the default URI, so we don't have to add anything to that. We'll just do a retrieve. We'll convert the response body to a mono, which is a publisher. It's a reactive entity, if you will. So we're going to expect a reactive publisher of string, but then we're going to block because we're not reactive in this example. Very simple to go from non-blocking to blocking, not simple to go the other way. So we start off with this. Web client, again, supports them both. So if we want to see our claims, string get claims, return web client.get.URI. We need to add on to that for our claims.retrieve.body to mono. All right, so we're going to wrap up on a high note here. So block. And then we'll do the same thing for our get mapping / email, string get email return web client.get.uri / email, right? Retrieve body to mono. Once again, we're just passing back a string block. So let's run this. Oh, it should. Good catch. Oh, I take back, I should have made you an admin. This is terrible. Okay, so let's restart this. Whew. Saved me just a couple minutes or a minute there, just, and that's precious right now because we're officially over time. So let's go ahead and wrap this up on a high note. So localhost, hopefully a high note, we'll find out. Localhost 8080. Let's go ahead and log in using Okta very quickly. Yep, and log in. And hey, we're there. So let me blow that up just a little bit, and then we'll go up here and let's grab something. And this should access something on our resource server. So it does. We're using JOTs to go ahead and authenticate without having to pass and repass and re-share our credentials. We just pass that encrypted web token that says, you got this. And you've got claims, right? You have certain claims that we're including, typos, claims. So there we go. We see our claims in OAuth 2 parlance, scopes, right? So we see that we have scopes of email, address, OpenID. Obviously, we wouldn't get to our claims because we filtered specifically on that. Phone and profile. I'm also going to go up here because we have email scope. So let's just check our email, and there's a subscriber email. So again, it's really not that hard to get started very quickly and easily with a super level of security out of the box. So let's go ahead and go back here. I'll show you where you can go for more information, and then we'll go. Grab some coffee. So here's the repo with all this code and a bit more, and more to be added as we go along as well. So Spring Security for Noobs under my GitHub repo, mkheck, which is also my Twitter handle, by the way. And the Spring Security Project page, if you will, the jumping off point, which includes documentation and pointing to the repo and what have you. Thanks for coming. Please stay in touch, stay secure, follow me on Twitter, and we'll just share more. We'll keep the conversation going. So thanks.